Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In this first episode, I'll be doing a build of two Brewster Buffalos from Hasegawa's 1/72nd scale US Navy combo set, which I did as a build for Model Minute's Not So Stealthy group build. As you'll see, these are the first kits I have ever used an airbrush on, and I also designed and 3D printed some extra details for the interior. So without further ado, let's get into building these kits. To begin with, I give all these sprues and my resin parts a wash in some warm soapy water to clean any oil or small debris off the parts which might prevent glue or paint from adhering to them. Once dry, I then cut out the fuselage halves and seat from the kit sprues using some side cutters, before then carefully removing any burring from the attachment points with a knife. Off camera, I primed all of my resin parts using some Vallejo white aerosol primer, and after cutting off the attachment points for the kit's cockpit, I used some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue to glue the cockpit sidewall details to the interior, the kit's plastic seat to my resin floor, and to fix the control column into place. I also had to repair my resin rudder pedals, which I printed attached to the main instrument panel, but they're rather delicate and possibly underscale. In subsequent versions, I've upgraded the rudder pedals by making them a little bit larger. I accidentally damaged the internal framework I'd printed for the wheel well, so I had to repair that one. While the glue bonds all the resin parts, I moved on to adding the forward fuselage sections. The instructions say to add this part after the main sections have been joined together, but to make adding the internal framework easier, I decided to attach it to the fuselage half a bit earlier. I repeated these same steps to add the second Buffalo. The F2A has a slightly longer nose with a different exhaust setup, so the forward halves are slightly different. Once both Buffalos were at the same stage, I trimmed the landing gear framework down slightly so that it could fit inside of the nose compartment, and then I glued it into place. The interior of US Navy Buffalos were apparently done in an aluminium lacquer finish, so I used some X20A acrylic thinners to thin down some Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium and brush painted the interior. I brush painted 2 coats of the flat aluminium, and then my airbrush finally arrived. I'd initially only brought Vallejo and AK acrylic thinners and cleaning products since these are my favourite paints to use, so I switched over to Vallejo's Model Air 71062 aluminium and finished off the base of the flat aluminium with a light coat mixed with a ratio of 50% thinner to 50% paint. After the final coat had been airbrushed on, I then switched back to the hairy stick to paint the instrument panel and the finer sidewall details with Vallejo flat black. I paint some of the raised switches, engine controls, and the pump next to the seat with Vallejo model colour US Field Drab, and Vallejo Vermilion Red was then used for various switches on the sidewalls, control stick, and the main instrument panel. To highlight the raised gauge details and small switches, I added some Vallejo flat white onto a brush and then dabbed away most of the paint until I only had a tiny amount left, which I then dry brushed onto the main instrument panel. Once dry, I then fixed up the excess white on the main instrument panel by mixing some flat black with a small amount of water and letting it flow into the gaps between all of the gauges and details. Further details in the cockpit are painted using flat yellow, vermilion red, and for the piping around the cockpit floor I used Vallejo 70924 Russian uniform green. On one cockpit part I accidentally damaged this piping, so I ended up painting some jewellery making wire with the uniform green and then using it as a replacement. I neatened up any mistakes I made using the Model Air aluminium and a brush, and once that's dry I paint the cover at the base of the control column with saddle brown and glued the replacement wiring and forward landing gear bay parts into place. With the interior painted, I then applied some enamel-based Tamiya black panel liner scent over all of the interior and landing gear bay to help highlight the details by letting it flow into all of the gaps and around the bases of raised areas. To help it flow further and make it less dark on the raised areas, I then use a cotton bud dipped in enamel thinners to wipe away the excess and thin it down so that it flows more. Once the enamel wash is dried, I then glue the instrument panel and cockpit floor into each of the two Buffalo's fuselages. Being resin parts, they sometimes don't always fit perfectly, and I found the rudder pedals had to be slightly modified as they were too small by removing them from the instrument panel and gluing them to the cockpit floor. The sidewall details also slightly interfered with the cockpit floor or the fuel tank area, so I trimmed a bit of them away and then used that to help line it up, and the fit was pretty much perfect. The final touch before joining the fuselage halves together was to add a tiny dab of Vallejo gloss varnish onto all of the gauges to add a glass-like shine to their faces. I then applied some more of the Deluxe Materials odorless CA glue to the resin parts, and some Revell Contactor Professional Poly Cement to the plastic ones, and pushed the two fuselage halves together. I used some Tamiya masking tape and a bulldog clip to hold the parts together and tighten up the slight gap between some parts of the fuselage halves while the glues bonded. I set the fuselages aside and moved on to cutting out the two upper and lower wing halves for each aircraft and glued them together, clamping them with some bulldog clips. If I were to ever do this kit in this scheme again, I would leave the wings off along with the horizontal stabilizers to make painting easier, but in this case I cut out and cleaned up the horizontal stabilizers, rear tail pieces, and the smaller accessories such as the tail wheel and hook to attach them to the model. Once the tail hook area had been cleaned up of any flashing, I glued the small hook to the inside of the rear half, added the other side, and then attached it to the rear of the fuselages. The tail wheel followed, and after the attachments had been sanded of any flash, I glued the horizontal stabilizers to the back of each Buffalo. The Navy Buffalos also have the life raft canister along with a headrest and some interior framework, which I cut out, assembled and added to the rear part of the cockpit area with plans to paint them later on. These parts were rather tight and fiddly, and more so with the F2A1 didn't seem to quite fit too well with the rear window section, which I'd discover later on. By now the fuselage was pretty solid, so I removed the tape and glued on the wings. I had to trim down the attachment points on the wings slightly and also use some of the CA glue so that it would bond to the resin fuel tank, but even so the fit was still pretty solid, and after the two halves had been pushed into the fuselage with a bit of pressure, they stuck pretty well. Another component I should have probably left off until later was the landing gear, which consists of the main strut, a wheel and landing gear cover. These parts were cut out, sanded and then glued together. The landing gear looks solid enough, but there is a bit of a weak point where the wheels attach, which I managed to break once on the F2A2 later on, and damaged several times on the F2A1. The landing gear was also a bit tricky to align with the outer and inner attachment points inside of the wings and fuselage, but with a bit of fiddling I managed to get a tight and correct looking fit. Next I cut out the base pieces of the engine and glued them into place. I like the way the engine and prop assembles in this kit, since you can add the engine followed by the front cowling parts, and then add a spinning prop as part of an assembly later on. The front sections differ slightly on the F2A1 and F2A2, but are still quite similar. Notably, the longer F2A2 has an extra two panels on both the upper and lower surface, which had to be glued into place. With most of the assembly complete, I prepare the model for painting by applying some Vallejo water-based putty over any of the gaps and seam lines present, and then I use a damp finger to carefully wipe away the excess putty, leaving it only in the gaps. I leave the putty overnight to dry, and the next day I sand down the seam lines and excess putty using a sanding stick for nails, followed by some very fine sandpaper to get a nice smooth finish. I then fix any recessed details that were lost to either the sanding or putty by carefully using a pointed scriber to re-scribe them, or in the case of the rivets just to do a small dot. Somehow I managed to break the wing off of the F2A1 while scribing a bit around the exhausts, so I left that part off until I was finished scribing and then glued the wings back on. Unfortunately, both wheels were also damaged, and though I managed to glue everything back into place, they definitely weren't as strong as they used to be. The last details I added were some brake lines based on reference photos, which I made by cutting out some very fine jewellery wire, bending it to shape, and then gluing it to the base of the wheels. I also hoped this would add a tiny bit more strength to them, but these brake lines would also prove fragile and not very noticeable, and I think 2 of them even broke off at one point, so I decided to just leave them off. Before priming the model, I then used my airbrush to blow any particles of dust off of the models, and then I used some white tack to mask over the cockpit from both the underside window and the upper side canopy. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. In the next part, we'll be painting the 2 schemes which my patrons and my YouTube members voted on, and it was very much in favour of the black F2A2 from the Lexington, and in second place was Thatcher's F2A1 Buffalo with the nice green paint. So be sure to subscribe and have notifications turned on so you don't miss that video. Drop any questions or feedback you have in the comments section below. I would love to hear what you guys think of these kits, and also if you've got any advice for myself or anyone else looking to improve in the hobby. If you would like to help me get more kits and supplies, have more voting power, and get early access to ad-free videos plus occasional exclusive content, then please consider joining my Patreon, which I'll leave a link to in the description. That's it for now, but until the next video, as always, take care and model on.